I'm Brian Professor B. Davis. Welcome to this Arena Sports Net Professor B's editorial. We'll take a look back at the 1994 MLB strike, baseball strike. So this week marked the 25th anniversary of this strike some 25 years ago. And I'm wearing a Montreal Expos jersey. We'll do a couple segments of how it got to this point, where the Expos, how they existed, and how the franchise ended up losing up in Montreal. Expos was existence in 1969. They resided in the National League East. They were the first Canadian team to reside outside the United States. They were also part of that expansion class with their other counterpart, the San Diego Padres, who would reside in the National League West that year in '69. Also, two other teams like the Kansas City Royals and the Seattle Pilots came in. They both resided in the American League West in '69. The Pilots lasted just one season before being sold to a car dealership named Bud Selig, who would relocate the franchise to Milwaukee, the county stadium, after the Braves left for Atlanta following the 1965 season. So with the Expos, they started their first 7 or 8 seasons at Jari Park, their original home. Had some pretty good names like Bill Stoneham, Legrand Larage, known as Rusty Staub, Legrand Larage, and some pretty good names. And their manager in their early years was Gene Mauch. And then in the mid-'70s, the Expos were struggling, and Dick Williams, who was the manager of the impossible dream season of the Red Sox turnaround in 1967 to the American League pennant, managed those Oakland A's teams in the early '70s to 2 of the 3 World Series titles they won in a row. Then, he took the Expos job after with the Angels, and then they really built a nucleus, and they used some of their resources and built it on the farm system, building the names like Andre Dawson, Gary Carter, Steve Rogers, Warren Cromartie, Jerry White, and a few others. And then by 1979, the Expos became a legitimate contender in the National League East. That they end up racking up a 95 and 66 record. They end up finishing a game and a half behind the eventual World Series champion Pittsburgh Pirates that year. Then the following year, in 1980, the Expos had the great race, losing 2 or 3 to the Philadelphia Phillies, and it was Mike Schmidt's home run, which is 48th, pretty much locked up the National League's most valuable player. Him, Mike Schmidt, Pete Rose, and Steve Carlton, the Phillies would go on to win the National League East and go on to win it all in 1980, win their franchise first World Series. The Expos end up finishing 1 game out behind the eventual champion Phillies in the 1980 season, finishing just a buck short. Then let's bring it to 1981. The Expos were going to be one of the favorites again. The Expos go off to a great start in the National League East. As you look back at that, in the first half of that season, it was the Expos right there. It was in third. If we take a look at the standings, this is what the standings were in the first half of that 81 season. The first half of the standings of the National League East was as follows. The Phillies, who were the defending world champs, were in first place with 34 wins, and they end up having 21 losses. The Cardinals were 30 and 20. The Expos were right there in the mix. They had right there in the mix in the National League East. They were right there, 30 and 25. The Pirates were 25 and 23. The Mets and the Cubs were the 2 basement bottom feeders in the National League East. And that's how on June 12th of 1981, that's when the strike began. This baseball strike lasted for 2 months, and it was a long, prolonged strike that lasted for 715 days. 2 months, over thousands of games were lost. They would not begin play till the second half of the second season on August 9th, when the team came back from the strike. The All-Star game was played to start off the second half, and The National League ended up winning that All-Star game 5-4, which, by the way, Gary Carter was named the MVP of that All-Star game. Gary Carter, who was one of my favorites, is the reason why I ended up being a catcher in high school, ended up having two home runs in that All-Star game. That was the difference. And hit a game-tying home run to set up their come-from-behind win over the American League. And Gary Carter, of course, by that time, gained the status as the best catcher in baseball from his counterpart protege, Johnny Bench. So that year in 81, the Expos were loaded. They added some new players in there, Tim Raines and Tim Wallach, replacing eventually be the ones replacing Larry Parrish in also Rodney Scott, as Tim Raines led the National League with 71 stolen bases, was the runner-up in the National League's Rookie of the Year behind Fernando Valenzuela. But this is how the second half ended up turning out to be in the National League East. So the Montreal Expos won the second half with a 30-23 record. The Cardinals finished a half game behind the Expos. Then it was the Phillies, the defending world champions, the reigning world champion Phillies, finishing a game, just barely a game above 500 as they were sluggish in the second half in the second season. Then it was the Mets, Cubs, and the Pirates rounding out the top 6 teams in the second season. By the second half of that season, Dick Williams, who was there for nearly 4.5 years, was given his walking papers. He was dismissed and was his replacement from the front office. Jim Fanning took over the club the rest of that season. The Expos ended up winning the National League East second half by a half game ahead of the St. Louis Cardinals. But the Expos were very fortunate to get a grant reprieve, because this would have been the overall record in the National League had they played the full season. Had they played the full season, this would have been, the Cardinals would have finished first. They would have finished 2 games ahead of the Expos. They would have finished 2.5 ahead of the world champion Phillies. And then the rest, rounding out that top 6, the Pirates, Mets, and Cubs would have been done. And the Expos should be very fortunate, even so that, because other than the strike, if they had played the full season, the Expos would be headed home for the winter for a long tee time on the golf field. So as the National League West, the Cincinnati Reds had the best overall record in the major leagues, but because they didn't win either half of the strike truncated season, the Reds were on the outside looking in of the postseason as well. So the Expos went into the playoffs. They were able to beat the Phillies, winning 3 out of 5 in the mini series, or the division series, as the Expos won their first ever National League East title outright. They were going to take on the Los Angeles Dodgers in the National League Championship Series. Both teams split the first 2 games in Los Angeles at Chavez Ravine in L.A. Then the Expos were up 2-1 and were 1 win away from the pennant. But then the Dodgers rebounded to win Game 4, and then after the rainout in Game 5 was pushed on a Monday, known as Blue Monday, it was a battle between Fernando Valenzuela and Ray Burris of the Expos. And then the 9th inning, Steve Rogers come out of the pen the pitch to Rick Monday. And remember, their closer, Jeff Reardon, was not available because he was injured, as Rick Monday blasted a home run on a 3-1 fastball from Steve Rogers to give the Dodgers a 2-1 lead. The Expos threatened in the 9th, but they fell just a buck short as the Dodgers end up advancing to the World Series. And a heartbreaking loss for Expos faithful there that day in Canada. And their record, despite, the next few years they contended, but between 79 through 82, they had the best record in the National League and really had the closest thing they would get to the World Series. It was just devastating for Expos fans because they would never get that close again. In 82, they finished third, finishing 6 games back behind the eventual world champion St. Louis Cardinals, who would go on to win the World Series in 82. 83, they finished to a mediocre third, 82 and 80, finishing 8 games behind the National League pennant-winning Phillies, and then they dramatically dropped off significantly. In 84, they finished 5th. That was, by the way, Gary Carter's final season with the Expos. He won another MVP in the All-Star game, hitting a home run at Candlestick Park in the National League's 3-1 win over the American League. He was dealt that offseason to the New York Mets for players in that trade, for Mike Fitzgerald, Hubie Brooks, and some other players in that trade as well. And the Mets, of course, became a legitimate contender. And, of course, he helped the Mets win the World Series back in 1986. The Expos really surprised a lot of people in 1987. They went 91 and 71 under Buck Rogers. Rogers took over the club in 1985. The Expos finished only 4 games behind the eventual National League pennant-winning Cardinals in 3rd place. 3 teams in that National League. They even finished a game behind the reigning world champion New York Mets that year as well. And for the Expos, the brightest moment of that season was Tim Raines hitting a grand slam after his contract holdout. Back then, if you didn't sign that agreement at a certain time when it expires, you could not renegotiate with that club until May 1st. He hit a grand slam against the Mets in his first game back in early May, and he ended up making the All-Star team. He had to get in as a write-in candidate. He was not even on the All-Star ballot. Hit a big 2-run triple to give the National League a 2-0 win over the American League in 15 innings over at the Oakland Coliseum in Oakland that year. And then you had some stalwarts on the mound. The veteran Dennis Martinez revitalized his career, and Big Cat Andres Galarraga. And the Expos were right there to the end. And then they kind of struggled in 88, 81, and 81, finishing 500 in 3rd place. But this is where it comes to 1989. This was a fascinating year. The Expos, with ownership Charles Brothman selling the team he founded, he had contemplated taking one last shot of a playoff berth. Brothman and gave young general manager Dave Dombrowski cleared to mandate the win now, reportedly told him he would provide all the money he needed Quest to bring a championship to Montreal in 1989. Dombrowski pulled off the massive trade in late May 25th, acquiring all-star left-handed pitcher, pending free agent Mark Langston for the Seattle Mariners, with the move viewed as a coup at the time, came at a very heavy cost as a young, tall, 6'10", Randy Johnson part of that deal to Pacific Northwest. Johnson would for fantastic stuff, become one of the most dominant left-handed pitchers over the next decade. Langston pitched 4 months for the club, left as a free agent, still seemed like a worthy gamble at the time for the Expos. That year, there was no dominant team in the National League. The team was poised to compete for the National League East crown. They had loaded pitchers with stars like Langston, Dennis Martinez, Brent Smith, Pascual Perez, and Kevin Gross. The team reached its peak on August 2nd with the best record in the National League at 63-44, holding a 3-game lead over the National League East. Everything turned to be running smoothly. What followed would go down as the greatest collapse in franchise history. The next night, Benny DeStefano's pinch hit single in the 12th dealt the Expos a 1-0 loss to the Pittsburgh Pirates. That would mark the beginning, the end of the Expos. It started a 7-game losing streak. The club limped into the rest of August, remaining in the race until early September, with the team only being 2 games out of back in first place on September the 6th. Regardless of the downward spiral, continued as the Expos inexplicably losing 37 of its final 55 games. They finished a disappointing mediocre 81-81, well out of the playoff race. The easiest analysts caused the collapse to the point per game for long-time Expos fans. The collapse viewed as the beginning of the end of the franchise. If the club would have won the National League East title that year, then beaten the Giants in the NLCS and clinched a World Series berth. In the process, Brothman may have changed his mind about selling the team. Instead, the late season collapse was such a big win move, add to the owner's frustration. And yes, it was. They had a chance in '89 to win that East, and really was no dominant team. The Mets thought they were the team to beat, the team that had multiple division titles in the second half of the decade. But the rest of going into the 90s, 1990, they were able to finish a respectable third, 85 and 77. They finished 10 games behind the National League East champion Pittsburgh Pirates. 91, things just went downfall. They finished 71 and 90, finishing dead last, 26 and a half games out of first place. And then what made matters worse to that, early in the year they fired Buck Rogers to bring in Tim Reynolds, and then that marked end up playing like their final home. A lot of their like 11 or 13 home games was canceled because of the the collapse of debris falling off of Olympic Stadium in Montreal, making the Olympic Stadium unplayable. And that was this was one of many listed problems for the Montreal Expos franchise. So now we go into the 90s. The Expos in 1992. Now they got the new uniforms, got the new swag, got the throwback here. Wearing the Vladimir Guerrero jersey. Expos end up finishing in 92. Tim Reynolds was fired in the early months of the season, bringing in former Giants manager or Giants outfielder Felipe Alou, who's an assistant coach on that staff, took over the team middle of the season. The Expos had some young nucleus with Marquise Grissom and Moises Alou, Felipe's son, and Larry Walker. The Expos got back towards respectability. They end up finishing with an 87-win season, finishing second, 9 games behind the Pirates. And then in 1993, they went 94 and 68. They trailed the Phillies by many as 9 games at one point, but they made a run with the Phillies down to the end, and time just kind of ran out for the Phillies for the Expos in 93. They finished 3 games behind the eventual National League champion Philadelphia Phillies in 93, because the National League East was not that dominant of a division like it had been with the Pirates losing all their big stars, Barry Bonds and Bobby Bonilla, and Doug Drabeck left. The Mets had totally overhauled their personnel in recent years with free agency, with the retirements of Gary Carter and Keith Hernandez. Darryl Strawberry, not happy in New York, leaving New York, go back home to L.A. And then the problems with Dwight Gooden and then some with the Mets franchise. And then, the Pirates couldn't keep all their big-name superstars. And then, the National League East was anybody's for the taking. And then the Expos in 1994, they signed the big name or a big trade when they traded Delino Shields for the Dodgers for a reliever named Pedro Martinez, who would go on to have a Hall of Fame career, had a great year in 94. The Expos, of course, that year in 1994 had the best record in the major leagues. As we look at the National League East, looking at that National League East, they were 74 and 40, 6 games up on the Braves, and we're on pace to finally get a taste of that World Series. And then the strike hit on August 12th, 94, and they did not play again the rest of the season. And then, it was a devastating loss for that franchise because the Expos were the best team in baseball. They even had guys with Ken Hill, John Wetland, Cliff Floyd, Darren Fletcher, Sean Barry, Mike Lansing, I should say. And the Expos, that team was built. They were, Dan Duquette put a great product on the field, and they just were not able to, with the strike, with the owners and players, and owners want to implement a salary cap, and the players did not want that, and that just really ruined everything for the 94 season. Costed Matt Williams and Ken Griffey a shot at Roger Maris' record. Costed Griffey and Frank Thomas, who both had over 160. They were on pace to have the combined for over 360 RBIs apiece to shatter Hack Wilson's single-season record. Jack Bagwell had a phenomenal year. Tony Gwynn on pace to hit 400. He was batting .394 at the strike. Wade Boggs was swinging the bat well, even though he was way a little past his prime. The Yankees also were the victims of it too, because the Yankees had the best record in the American League. Question was that Don Mattingly may have been his last great opportunity to play in postseason. He would unfortunately have to wait for one more year, and then, it was just an ugly thing, that strike. Not just for baseball, but for all the for parking attendants, concessionaires, the people working the ballpark trying to make a living. It was just devastating. And then on that date, on September 14th, 34 days with no agreement, the acting commissioner at the time, Bud Selig, said the season was over. The rest of the season was canceled. There'll be no playoffs or World Series for the first time since 1903. And that marked the beginning of the end, and kind of was baseball's version of the death penalty for the Expos franchise. And as a result of that strike continued. They finally got an agreement in 1995, but new general manager Kevin Malone, who replaced Dan Duquette, who left to go to the Boston Red Sox, he was ordered to dismantle the team. Guys like Marquise Grissom going to the Braves, and Ken Hill went to Cleveland. John Wetland ended up going to the New York Yankees. All three of those players end up going to play on World Series teams. Wetland and Grissom both end up getting World Series rings. As a result, the Expos kept a few players, but they were going to be gone within the next few years. 95, they finished 12 games under 500 and dead last. 24 games behind the World Series soon-to-be champion Braves. Then in 96, and people forget, the Expos were able to got back to respectability, finished in second, only 2 games out of the wild card, was not mathematically eliminated to the season's next to last day of the 96 season. But then they finished back to under 500. Then they traded Pedro Martinez, who won the National League Cy Young Award that year in 97, to the Red Sox. The Expos continue to have their financial problems. They tried to get a new ballpark. It never got materialized. The ownership of the Expos was cheap. 98, they finished the first of 4 straight 90-plus loss seasons, losing at least 94 or 95 games or more all 4 years. And then Felipe Alou was dismissed as Expos manager early in the 01 season when Jeffrey Loria bought the team. Then, eventually, Major League Baseball got control of the team. And in 2003, the Expos played half of their games at Olympic Stadium and down in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And people forget, in 2002, the Expos made a run at the wild card. They got Bartolo Colon and Lee Stevens in that big trade for Cleveland for a young outfielder named Grady Sizemore. And then in 03, they were right there in the wild card chase, I think 2 games up in late August. And then they faded out of the race. The Marlins won on that run. The Expos finished 8 games behind the eventual World Series champion Florida Marlins. And that just shows you right there, the Marlins, who had a worse record than the team, the same franchise, who had financial difficulties, something we could talk about another time. The Expos end up finishing up. The Expos could just never crack through. And then in their final season, the Expos finished with 95 losses. It was the 5th time in 8 years they had a 90-plus loss campaign. And it was the final season that Major League Baseball, who now had control of the Expos franchise, they announced that they were going to move the team to Washington, D.C. And it was a sad thing that they all fall back to the baseball strike in 94. You think about this, if they played the full season, the Expos were on pace to win 104 games. And even if they did not get to the World Series, they were guaranteed to get some revenue money come in, where they have a chance to sign some of these players for long-term deals. But that strike and the Expos be on the end of both ends of labor negotiations issues 2 times. And I could look back in retrospect of the 94 strike 25 years ago. I would have to say the fault was definitely on by the owners. The owners should not have gotten to have a salary cap for competitive balance with the big market and small market teams, and you just couldn't. And it lost a generation of baseball fans, and people who I knew at the time didn't blame them for not going out to the ballpark, because the owners are just the rich. The owners didn't want to share their piece of the pie to the small market teams, and just it was a big mess. But I hope one day, Baseball returns to Montreal. It's a great legacy. It's just a shame they were on the short end of due to two labor work stoppages. The strike in 94, of course, the baseball strike back in 81 that nearly could have costed them a chance if they would have won the League Championship Series in 81 against the Dodgers, or if they would have went to the series in 94, I think, or was it for the collapse of their late season collapse of 89, I believe still today be in Montreal. And, that's just the economics of baseball. Life doesn't treat us fair at times. And, baseball is a business and has gotten better in the post-strike after, people have come back and support the team. But I think it's a lesson learned from that baseball strike in 94 that, it's the old saying in sports and life, it's a very fragile thing. When you have an opportunity, you best take full advantage of it. Because if you don't take full advantage of the opportunity when it's open, the window's open right there, it will close on you just like that. And like when the golden goose flies away, it will be a very long time before another golden goose returns. That's it for now. I'm Brian Professor B. Davis. Thank you for watching this special edition of ASN Bay Area Professor B's Editorial. I look back at the 1994 MLB strike and the tragedy of the Montreal Expos. Check me out at youtube.com/Professor B Media. Thank you for watching.